The shots that you just saw have been filmed entirely with what is called a multi-rotor or quadcopter. Commonly referred to as a drone, multi-rotors have taken the aerial film industry by storm for various reasons. Today, we will be diving into the history as well as the evolution of UAV technology. This is Flight Chronicles. A multi-rotor is best defined as a helicopter having more than two rotors, typically one designed for unmanned flight. The very first experimental attempts of taking off with a multi-rotor were done around 1907. Jacques and Louis Breguet were French brothers. They built and tested the first ever gyroplane and the first ever quadcopter. They managed to take off, although the design proved to be very unstable and hence impractical. Another iteration was created in 1924 by a French engineer named Etienne Omichen. He flew his quadcopter a distance of 360 meters, or 1,181 feet, setting a world record. In the same year, he flew 1 kilometer, or 0.62 miles, in a circle in 7 minutes and 40 seconds. Around the same time, Georges de Beautazat built and tested his quadcopter for the U.S. Army. He completed a number of test flights before the program was ultimately scrapped. Early designers experimented with quadcopters because the alternative, using a single main rotor with a tail motor to counterbalance the torque created by the single main rotor, seemed wasteful, complex, and inefficient. The tail rotor on a single rotor helicopter design consumes between 10 and 15% of the engine power, yet it creates no lift or forward thrust. Part of the main rotor rotates over the fuselage, pushing down washed air against it, reducing effective lift. On top of that, making large rotor blades 4 or 5 meters long or even longer was a huge problem, and larger rotors to this day are proportionally much heavier than smaller ones. To be fair, getting a multi-rotor off the ground at a time without computers or good electric motors is a feat in and of itself. Nowadays, multi-rotors use advanced flight controllers, electronic speed controllers, and brushless motors. These advancements in technology have been essential for the development of a stable and flyable aircraft. To understand more about the industry and the evolution of the technology, I consulted a professional. I held an interview with Chad Kapper, a former film producer and current CEO of Rotor Riot, a multi-rotor based company with an aim at first-person view, freestyle, and racing.
Built my first multi-rotor, I built my first quadcopter, and I'm very intrigued with not just the process of building them, but the history and what they are for the film industry as a whole. How did you get into multi-rotors for you? Like, what was your first experience?
Well, my first experience was I saw a company out of Canada called Dragonfly.
Okay.
And this was back in like 2009, and they were making multi-rotors that had cameras on them. And, you know, back then FPV and drones, right, and, you know, was not a very common thing at all. But I got it in my head, I wanted to build one of these. I wanted to find a way to put cameras in the sky and you know, get some really great aerial photos. I thought maybe I'd start a business doing aerial photography because I already had a video production company.
Right.
And so I, you know, got online and tried to figure out what it was that I could do, what I could build. I came across a thing called Arducopter, and it's an Arduino based multi-rotor controller. And I built my first quad out of whatever hobby parts I could get a hold of, and it flew horribly and never quite a usable platform. And it was very early on, very little support anywhere.
Right.
So, but during that process, I got interested in other things like airplanes, like RC airplanes.
Yeah.
And then I started putting cameras on planes, and I started getting some aerial footage that I wanted. So I kind of took a break from the multi-rotor side because it was just so problematic and cumbersome at the time.
Right.
And then I just completely got immersed into the radio control flight hobby, and I started a company called Flight Test, and that was back in 2010. And we started as a YouTube channel and eventually started selling our own products.
Yeah, I think it's super cool that you're a film producer and you definitely have the appreciation for not just the hobby side of flight, but also the film side of it and the applications there. If you could speak on what your applications are to the film industry.
Well, I can't. The thing is once, here's the funny thing. I wanted to be a film director all of my life. Like that was what, I got into video production because I wanted to direct movies. And,
right.
And I actually directed a couple features. And what was funny was once I really started making YouTube content, I kind of lost that passion for, I guess, traditional filmmaking. And I was all about, making content for the web.
Right.
And I just really enjoyed it. I liked the more sincere, real approach, where it wasn't, you weren't making things up. You're just experiencing life and your hobby and getting to share it, and people enjoyed watching it. So I lost that desire to do, aerial filmmaking. I think the other part was about the time that it started really picking up and people were, using a lot for features and commercials and that, which I had done a few.
Right.
It kind of lost its luster for me because by that point it was probably 4 years later, and I'd already just fallen in love with like engineering and developing aircraft and all of that. So my personal experience in filmmaking with drones really consists of a couple of, regional TV commercials. And then I did a feature film called Rotor DR1 in 2015. That was a full-length feature film about drones in the future. Actually, it's a little bit scary if you watch it now because the whole opening of the film talks about a pandemic and how drones are going to deliver medical supplies. And it's kind of eerie to watch the beginning of it right now because it's so relevant. I sold Flight Test, the company, back in 2014, and then I had moved on and developed a new channel called Rotor Riot. And so Rotor Riot's more specific to racing and not so much racing as much as freestyle. Mm-hmm. So it's all based on experimenting and viewing the whole freestyle culture. And in the hobby, I would say maybe there's kind of like three main segments. You have planes, you have what I call mini quads, or race and freestyle, and then you have like camera drones, and that's more the cinematic side. I would say Casey Neistat covers a little more of the the cinematic type of stuff. We use it for different episodes, like I have a Phantom and a Mavic and all the DJI goodies that we've used. We've been to Chernobyl and the Great Wall of China and stuff like that. So you can see some like real epic aerials from those episodes, especially Chernobyl. You should check that one out. That one's got some really great aerial photography or videography.
Where do you see the future of the hobby and multi-rotors as a whole being implemented next? Like, what do you think the next big push is for things?
I'm pretty certain the next big push is going to be following stunts. I mean, it's really, they've been doing that. Some of the top pilots have been following motocross and skateboarders, and but mini quads can move and behave and travel in ways that you just could never in the past. Like you couldn't even dream of the stuff that can be captured now.
Yeah.
I mean, we have an episode coming up where we had an episode already released where they chased arrows. So there's an archer, shooting
really?
arrows, and then the mini quad comes up just as he releases it and follows the arrow. I mean, you could never do that stuff before.
So more based on the history side of things, the first ever UAV was in multi-rotor anyway, quadcopter, was in 1924 by a French engineer. He flew his quadcopter a distance of 360 meters, and that was a world record for a UAV at the time because it was one of the first ever. So
right,
coming from 1924, creating something that only flies 360 meters to now, technology has changed so much in the way we work with engineering and the way we work with multi-rotors and UAVs. There's been implementations into military, into shipping, into all these things. As the average consumer, what do you think we should appreciate the most about it? Because I know I already asked you kind of like what are the next implementations, but what should we as the consumer be most appreciative about where it came from and where the hobby and technology is going?
I think that's a really good question and one I've never been asked, but I do have an answer, and I think it's well, first off, before I answer it completely, let me set up the answer a little bit. A lot of the technology already existed over the past 20 years. So it wasn't like in 2010 there was some technological advancement that made it possible.
Right.
Although there was lithium polymer batteries got better, lighter, cheaper, stronger. Brushless motors became cheaper and more powerful. But the real advancements came from ingenuity. It came from people. Here's what I believe. I believe that the parts got cheap enough and abundant enough that enough of the hobbyists were able to go experiment. Because if you just leave everything to the scientists, nothing ever, I don't want to say nothing gets done, but only the stuff that has to get done gets done. If you leave it to the hobbyists, they will dream, and they're the artists that are also scientists. And, I call them the backyard scientists. And what happened was, I think through the early, 2010s, people were able to experiment with a lot of things because flight controllers existed, but they were just horrible. So it wasn't necessarily the technology, because the gyros existed, accelerometers existed. Of course they got better, but that wasn't the bottleneck. The bottleneck was the code, was being able to develop, proper filtering and codes and PIDs.
Right. Yeah.
And not only that, it was a thrust to weight ratio kind of thing, like getting the right propellers with the right motors. I would have to say even propellers, because propellers weren't meant, like small 5-inch propellers weren't meant to hang things in the air. They were meant to pull aircraft forward. So, and the other thing is, if you look, engineers and looking at paper, you should use a 2-bladed prop, but everybody flies 3-bladed props. They fly 3-bladed props because they have better grip in the air. So it gives you more like yaw authority and you have more grip. So even though they're less efficient, you get more control. And that's really important for a mini quad. And that's the kind of stuff that an engineer could tell you, that this, less efficient prop might give you drag, but they don't realize it's going to translate into grip, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then, again, you have like the software technology coupled with the technology of the flight controllers. And I think, in the frame designs, like people don't know that certain designs are going to resonate the way that they do and introduce new vibrations and issues with which then the flight controller needs to filter out. So what happens is in the hobby, you have all these people attacking it from different directions. You have frame manufacturers trying to make frames more rigid and less, creating less resonant or secondary resonance. And then you have flight controller people trying to write code that will filter out those. And then you have other hardware people trying to soft mount the motors but you have everybody attacking these problems at the same time because they're realizing things are possible. Then, it's just a filtration after that. It's you just throw all this stuff out there and then people use it, and then they don't use the stuff that's cumbersome and they do use the stuff that works.
Right.
And eventually you get, the mini quads that you have today that can move like we've never imagined.
From 1907 to 2020, multi-rotor tech will continue to improve exponentially. As Chad stated, the hobbyists are the driving force in the industry when it comes to innovation and pushing the boundaries. We've come this far, why not fly further?